Modern culture constantly whispers that a fuller life is always a better life, pushing us toward more possessions, more achievements, more experiences, and more recognition at every turn. We chase bigger homes, fuller calendars, longer resumes, and wider social circles, believing each addition brings us closer to genuine happiness. But what if this constant chase for more is actually pulling us further away from the peace we are searching for? Simplicity is not deprivation, and it is not settling for less than we deserve in any meaningful sense. According to Carl Jung, the ego constantly seeks expansion, accumulation, and outward proof of success, while the deeper self quietly thrives on clarity and space. In this video, we will explore why choosing a simpler life, deliberately and without guilt, may be one of the wisest decisions you ever make for yourself. Number 1. Simplicity clears space for the self to breathe. Carl Jung wrote something important about this pattern, though he was originally describing a slightly different aspect of human psychology entirely. He described the persona as the mask people wear, shaped by what others expect them to become rather than who they truly are. This mask does not only apply to social behavior and polite interactions with coworkers, family, or strangers throughout an ordinary day. It also applies directly to material accumulation, the quiet performance of appearing successful, accomplished, and constantly moving upward in life. A larger apartment, a newer car, a more impressive title, these become props supporting a carefully maintained image of success. This image often has very little connection to genuine happiness, satisfaction, or the actual quality of someone's daily inner experience. Let me tell you about a man in his early 30s who wrote to us after watching one of our earlier videos on simplicity. He explained that for nearly a decade, he had steadily upgraded almost every part of his visible life without ever really questioning why. He moved into a larger apartment, filled it with newer furniture, replaced his wardrobe with more expensive clothing every single season. He upgraded his phone, his laptop, his car, always chasing the next slightly better version of whatever he already owned. Each purchase brought a brief flash of satisfaction, quickly followed by a strange, persistent feeling of emptiness returning almost immediately afterward. He assumed the solution was simply buying more, upgrading further, adding one more thing that might finally make the emptiness disappear completely. Instead, the emptiness only grew larger with each new purchase, no matter how much he spent or how impressive the item appeared. Eventually, exhausted and confused, he began wondering if the constant upgrading itself was actually the problem all along. His experience reflects something many people quietly recognize once it is described clearly and honestly like this. Accumulation rarely satisfies the deeper hunger it promises to solve, because that hunger was never truly about the object itself. Think about a room filled completely with objects, each one competing loudly for attention, none of them ever truly appreciated individually. When a room contains 10 meaningful items, each one can be seen clearly, touched thoughtfully, and genuinely enjoyed without distraction pulling attention elsewhere constantly. When that same room contains 100 items, no single object receives real attention, since the eye keeps jumping restlessly between countless competing distractions. The human mind works according to this exact same principle, whether applied to physical possessions or to commitments, goals, and obligations. A life filled with countless commitments cannot give full attention to any single one of them, no matter how important each one feels individually. Modern psychological research supports this idea clearly, even though the language used differs significantly from Jung's original writing decades ago. Studies on decision fatigue show that every choice a person makes, even small and seemingly unimportant ones, consumes real mental energy throughout the day. The more options someone has, the more energy gets spent simply deciding, comparing, and evaluating before any actual decision is finally made. This creates a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with overloaded mental resources instead. Clutter, Whether physical clutter, filling a room, or mental clutter, filling a schedule, produces measurable anxiety according to numerous psychological studies conducted in recent years. This happens because the brain constantly registers unfinished business and used objects and unmade decisions as a low-level background source of stress. Even when someone is not actively thinking about their cluttered garage or overflowing closet, their mind still registers its presence quietly and persistently. This background stress accumulates slowly over time, contributing to a general sense of unease that many people cannot clearly explain or identify. The man from our story eventually decided to try something different after years of unsuccessful upgrading and accumulating without any real satisfaction achieved. He began removing things instead of adding them, starting with his closet, donating clothing he had not worn over a year. Then he moved to his apartment, selling furniture that no longer served any real purpose beyond simply occupying space and collecting dust. He canceled subscriptions he barely used, unsubscribed from newsletters promoting products he did not actually need, and simplified his daily routine significantly. At first, this process felt strange, almost uncomfortable, as though he were losing something important that had always been part of his identity. But slowly, as the clutter cleared, something unexpected began happening that he had not anticipated experiencing at any point during this process. He started noticing small things he had completely overlooked before: the quality of morning light entering his kitchen, the taste of his coffee. These small observations had always been available to him, yet they had been buried underneath years of accumulated noise and constant distraction. This pattern reveals something important about how accumulation actually functions within most people's daily lives, whether they consciously recognize this pattern or not. Excess does not add richness to life in the way most people assume it eventually will, given enough time and enough resources available. Instead, excess often buries the very things that could have brought genuine richness, simply because there is too much competing for attention simultaneously. When someone finally removes the unnecessary, layer by layer, they often discover something valuable was always present underneath everything they had accumulated. Not a dramatic transformation or a sudden burst of happiness arriving instantly, but something quieter, steadier, and far more sustainable over time. A version of themselves capable of noticing small pleasures, appreciating simple moments, and feeling genuinely present rather than constantly distracted by more. This does not mean that all possessions, achievements, or ambitions are inherently harmful or should be avoided entirely throughout someone's life. It simply means that not every addition to life actually adds value, despite how convincingly it might be marketed or presented initially. Sometimes what a person genuinely needs is not one more thing, but the removal of things that were never truly necessary. This distinction matters significantly because it changes how someone evaluates every future purchase, commitment, or opportunity presented to them going forward. Instead of automatically assuming more will improve their life, a person can pause and honestly ask whether this specific addition truly serves them. Consider how the man's constant upgrading never actually addressed the underlying emptiness he felt rising steadily beneath every new purchase he made. His purchases functioned more like distractions than genuine solutions to whatever discomfort quietly existed underneath all that accumulated material success. Only by removing things, rather than adding them, did he begin understanding what he actually valued instead of what he had simply been taught. This process did not require him to become minimalist in some extreme, rigid sense, rejecting all possessions or comfort entirely from his life. It simply required him to notice the difference between things that genuinely serve his life and things that merely cluttered it further. The deeper lesson embedded within this entire pattern becomes remarkably clear once stated plainly and directly like this. Life does not always improve through addition, expansion, and constant accumulation of more possessions, more achievements, or more experiences. Sometimes the wisest, most courageous choice available is simply removing what no longer serves a genuine, meaningful purpose in someone's life. When people finally recognize that more does not automatically mean better, an entirely different relationship with their own life begins forming naturally. This relationship rests on clarity, intentionality, and a willingness to question inherited assumptions about what success and fulfillment actually require. And from that clearer foundation, a simpler, more spacious way of living gradually begins revealing itself, piece by piece, over time. Not a life forced into rigid restriction by extreme rules about minimalism or deprivation demanded from external pressure, but a life that naturally becomes lighter, clearer, and more genuinely satisfying once the unnecessary clutter finally clears away completely. Much of the complexity crowding modern life does not come from genuine necessity, but from constantly comparing ourselves to everyone visible around us. Social media has made this comparison nearly constant, showing carefully curated glimpses of other people's homes, vacations, careers, and apparent happiness throughout every single day. Even without social media, comparison quietly shapes decisions through neighbors, coworkers, family gatherings, and casual conversations about who achieved what recently. This constant measuring against others creates invisible pressure to match a pace, a lifestyle, or a standard that was never actually chosen deliberately. Instead, it was simply absorbed gradually, layer by layer, until it started feeling like a personal goal rather than an external expectation. Carl Jung described a process he called individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who someone truly and authentically is beneath layers of external expectation. He believed this process required a person to gradually separate from unconscious identification with the collective values surrounding them constantly. This separation does not mean rejecting other people or isolating completely from shared community and connection with those around us. It means recognizing which desires are genuinely personal and which desires were simply absorbed from watching everyone else pursue the exact same things. Most people never pause long enough to ask this question clearly, since comparison operates quietly in the background of daily thinking. Without noticing, a person can spend years chasing goals that were never truly their own, simply because everyone around them seemed to want the same things. Let me tell you about a woman who wrote to us after leaving a demanding, image-driven career in a large city several years ago. She had spent nearly a decade working in a field that rewarded visible success, constant networking, and carefully maintained personal branding across every professional interaction. Her apartment, her wardrobe, her social calendar, all of it was shaped by an unspoken competition with colleagues pursuing similarly visible markers of success. She described feeling constantly slightly behind, no matter how much she achieved, since there was always someone else achieving something slightly more impressive. Eventually, exhausted by this endless comparison, she made a decision that surprised almost everyone who knew her at the time. She left her career entirely and moved to a small town, choosing a quieter, far less impressive lifestyle by conventional standards. At first, she worried constantly about what people would think, imagining judgment from former colleagues who once admired her ambitious, fast-paced life. But something unexpected happened almost immediately after she settled into her new, much simpler surroundings and daily routine. She described feeling an overwhelming sense of relief, as though she had finally been allowed to stop performing for an audience that never truly existed. Her story illustrates something important about how comparison quietly shapes needs that were never genuinely personal to begin with. Picture a mirror surrounded by dozens of other mirrors, each reflecting a slightly different image, making it impossible to see your own true reflection clearly. This is what constant comparison does to a person's sense of identity, surrounding them with countless reflections until their authentic self becomes genuinely difficult to locate. Every reflected image suggests a different standard, a different pace, a different definition of what a good life should actually look like. Without removing these surrounding mirrors, even briefly, A person cannot clearly see what they themselves actually want, independent of everyone else's example. The woman in our story only discovered her genuine preferences after removing herself physically from the environment that had been reflecting so many competing images at once. Comparison does something specific and measurable to human psychology, creating artificial needs that feel completely real and urgent despite never being genuinely necessary. When someone constantly sees others achieving more, acquiring more, or experiencing more, their own baseline expectation quietly shifts upward without them noticing directly. What once felt like plenty suddenly feels insufficient, not because circumstances changed, but because the surrounding comparison point shifted significantly higher than before. This explains why increased income rarely produces lasting increased happiness beyond a certain reasonable threshold, according to numerous studies conducted on this exact pattern. As income rises, comparison groups often shift correspondingly, meaning satisfaction remains elusive regardless of how much someone actually earns or accumulates. The goalpost keeps moving, not because personal needs are genuinely expanding, but because the comparison reference point keeps shifting alongside rising circumstances constantly. When someone removes these external reference points, even temporarily, something valuable begins happening that comparison had been quietly preventing all along. They start noticing what they actually want, independent of what everyone around them seems to want or expect from a successful life. This often turns out to be remarkably smaller and simpler than previously assumed, once the noise of comparison finally settles into quiet stillness. The woman from our story discovered she genuinely preferred quiet mornings, meaningful conversations with a small circle of friends, and unhurried afternoons without constant professional obligations. None of these preferences required an impressive apartment, an expensive wardrobe, or a carefully curated professional image maintained constantly for others to observe and admire. They simply required removing the comparison that had been obscuring these genuine preferences underneath years of absorbed external expectation and unspoken competition. This does not mean ambition, ability to achieve, and personal goals are inherently problematic or should be avoided entirely by everyone seeking greater simplicity. It means distinguishing clearly between goals that genuinely reflect personal values and goals absorbed simply from watching others pursue identical things repeatedly. This distinction becomes clearer once comparison quiets down, allowing a person to hear their own preferences without competing external noise drowning them out constantly. Many people discover, much like the woman in our story, that their actual needs are far more modest than the constant comparison had suggested. A smaller home, a simpler wardrobe, a quieter schedule, these often turn out to be genuinely sufficient once artificial comparison-driven needs are finally removed completely. The deeper lesson here becomes clear once stated directly and simply, without unnecessary complexity or elaborate psychological explanation required to understand it fully. Much of what feels urgently necessary in modern life is not personally chosen, but absorbed gradually through constant comparison with everyone visible around us daily. When someone finally steps back from this comparison, even briefly, they often discover their genuine needs are smaller, quieter, and far more manageable than previously assumed. This discovery does not represent failure or lowered ambition, but genuine clarity about what actually matters to that specific person individually. From this clarity, a simpler life naturally begins emerging, not through forced restriction, but through honest recognition of what was never truly necessary. And once this quieter clarity settles in fully, something else becomes possible, a deeper capacity to remain genuinely present within each ordinary moment. A life crowded with tasks, notifications, and constant stimulation makes full presence remarkably difficult to achieve, no matter how much someone genuinely wants to slow down. Attention naturally becomes divided when there's always another task waiting, another notification buzzing, another obligation quietly demanding acknowledgement in the background. Even during rest, Many people find themselves mentally rehearsing tomorrow's schedule or replaying today's unfinished business instead of genuinely experiencing the present moment. This divided attention prevents full engagement with whatever is actually happening right now, whether that is a conversation, a meal, or a simple walk outside. There is an old pattern found across many cultures involving monks, hermits, or contemplative figures who deliberately simplify their surroundings to cultivate complete presence in ordinary activities. These figures do not seek presence through dramatic experiences or exotic travel, but through small, repeated routines performed with full attention every single time. Tending a small garden, preparing tea slowly, walking the same quiet path daily, these become opportunities for genuine presence rather than mundane tasks to rush through quickly. What makes these routines meaningful is not their complexity, but the complete attention brought to them, undivided by competing distractions or mental noise. A person tending a garden with full attention experiences something entirely different from a person tending the same garden while thinking about work email simultaneously. Consider someone who decides, almost on impulse, to cancel every unnecessary plan scheduled for an upcoming weekend, leaving deliberately open, unstructured time available. Instead of filling this time with errands, social obligations, or entertainment, they decide to cook a single meal slowly, without rushing or multitasking simultaneously. They chop vegetables without checking their phone. They stir a pot without simultaneously watching television. They set the table without hurrying toward the next task. Eating this meal afterward feels noticeably different from countless previous meals eaten quickly while scrolling through a phone or watching something distracting nearby. The flavors seem more vivid, the textures more noticeable, the entire experience more satisfying despite the meal itself being relatively simple and unremarkable by most standards. This person later describes this ordinary weekend as unexpectedly memorable, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because they were genuinely present for something ordinary. Modern research on attention and mindfulness supports this experience clearly, showing that reducing external inputs significantly increases the brain's capacity to fully register experience. When multiple sources compete simultaneously for attention, the brain divides limited resources across all of them, reducing the depth of engagement with any single source. This explains why eating while distracted often leaves someone barely remembering what they ate, despite having physically consumed an entire meal moments earlier. The brain simply did not fully register the experience, since its attention was divided across the food, the screen, and whatever else demanded simultaneous focus. When distractions are removed, even temporarily, the brain can fully engage with a single experience, producing a noticeably richer and more memorable outcome. This is not a minor difference easily dismissed as unimportant, but a fundamental shift in how deeply someone actually experiences their own life moment to moment. Think about the simple difference between tasting food while scrolling through a phone compared to eating that exact same food in complete silence without distraction. The food itself remains identical in both scenarios, yet the actual experience differs dramatically depending on how much attention was genuinely available to register fully. Scrolling divides attention between the screen and the mouth, leaving neither experience particularly vivid or memorable once the meal concludes shortly afterward. Silence allows full attention to rest entirely on the meal, noticing textures, flavors, and satisfaction that would have otherwise gone completely unnoticed. This principle extends far beyond eating alone, applying equally to conversations, walks, work tasks, and virtually every other ordinary daily activity performed regularly. A simplified life, one with fewer competing demands and less constant stimulation, creates more opportunities for this kind of full, undivided presence throughout each day. This does not require dramatic lifestyle changes, extended retreats, or complete withdrawal from modern conveniences and technology altogether in someone's daily life. It simply requires deliberately reducing the number of things competing for attention during specific moments, allowing full presence to naturally emerge instead. turning off notifications during a meal, leaving the phone in another room during a conversation, walking without headphones occasionally. These small adjustments accumulate meaningfully over time. Each adjustment removes one layer of competing stimulation, gradually restoring the brain's natural capacity to fully register whatever is actually happening in that specific moment. Over time, this practice becomes less effortful and more natural, since the brain relearns how to settle into single-pointed attention without immediately seeking additional stimulation. The person who cooked that slow, undistracted meal later described something interesting when reflecting on the experience afterward, weeks after that particular weekend had already passed. They noticed that this single experience of full presence had subtly changed how they approached other activities throughout the following weeks afterward. They began eating other meals more slowly, noticing conversations more fully, even noticing their own thoughts and feelings with greater clarity than before. This single, simplified experience seemed to demonstrate something valuable that gradually extended into other areas of their daily life afterward. Presence, once experienced clearly even briefly, becomes something a person naturally wants to return to again, recognizing how much richer ordinary moments become. This connects directly to something deeper than simply enjoying meals or walks more fully throughout an ordinary week or weekend. Presence built through simplicity gradually changes how a person relates to their own decisions, their own energy, and their own sense of daily satisfaction. When someone regularly experiences full presence, even in small, ordinary moments, they begin noticing which activities genuinely deserve their limited time and attention going forward. This awareness naturally influences future choices, encouraging fewer commitments pursued with greater attention rather than countless commitments pursued with divided, diminished attention throughout each day. And as this pattern continues, something else becomes possible, a noticeable shift in how much energy remains available for genuinely meaningful pursuits and relationships. Carl Jung described psychological energy, sometimes called libido in his work, as a limited resource that fuels every action, thought, and effort throughout a person's daily life. Maintaining a complicated life filled with many possessions, obligations, and constant commitments quietly drains this energy without a person ever fully noticing the ongoing loss. Every possession requires some form of maintenance, whether cleaning, organizing, repairing, or simply managing its presence within an already crowded living space. Every commitment requires mental tracking, scheduling, and follow-through, consuming attention even during moments when the commitment itself is not actively happening. This constant outward drain accumulates slowly, leaving surprisingly little energy available for the things a person actually values most in their daily life. Jung once warned that every form of addiction carries genuine risk, whether the substance involved is alcohol, morphine, or something as seemingly harmless as an idea or ideal. This warning extends naturally to a quieter, more socially acceptable form of addiction, the constant pursuit of accumulation, status, and always slightly more than what currently exists. This particular addiction rarely looks dangerous from the outside, since it is frequently praised as ambition, success, or admirable personal achievement by everyone observing from a distance. Yet it drains the same limited internal reserve, slowly and consistently, the same way any other addictive pattern eventually does over time. The difference is that this drain remains largely invisible, disguised as normal, responsible, even impressive behavior within most modern social and professional environments. Let me tell you about a man who wrote to us after realizing something uncomfortable about his own life during an otherwise ordinary evening at home. He owned a large house, subscribed to numerous streaming services, memberships, and subscription boxes, and maintained an unusually busy social calendar filled with constant obligations. On paper, his life appeared successful, full, and enviable to almost anyone observing from the outside without deeper insight into his daily experience. Yet he realized, sitting alone one evening, that he had almost no energy remaining for the relationships and hobbies he genuinely cared about most deeply. His large house required constant cleaning and maintenance. His subscriptions required constant management, and his busy calendar left him perpetually exhausted before any meaningful activity even began. He had unintentionally built a life that consumed nearly all his available energy, simply maintaining its own complicated structure, leaving nothing left over afterward. What remained of his time and attention went entirely toward upkeep, management, and obligation, rather than toward anything he would have genuinely chosen if starting completely fresh. His realization mirrors something many people eventually discover once they honestly examine where their daily energy actually goes throughout an ordinary week or month. Picture a suitcase overpacked for a trip, filled with far more items than the traveler will ever actually use during their entire journey. The traveler spends considerable energy simply managing this excess weight, lifting it, dragging it, worrying about it, rather than actually enjoying the destination they traveled toward originally. A lighter suitcase, containing only genuinely necessary items, allows the traveler to move freely, enjoy the journey fully, and arrive at their destination with energy still remaining. Life operates according to this exact same principle, whether applied to physical possessions, financial obligations, or social and professional commitments accumulated gradually over many years. An overpacked life consumes energy simply through its own maintenance, leaving little remaining for genuine enjoyment, connection, or meaningful engagement with anything else. If this pattern feels familiar to you, consider sharing in the comments below one thing you removed from your life that immediately gave you noticeably more energy or peace afterward. It might be a subscription canceled, a commitment declined, a possession donated, or simply a habit abandoned that no longer served any genuine purpose. Reading these comments often reveals how universal this experience actually is, even though it rarely gets discussed openly in most everyday conversations between friends or family members. Many people carry unnecessary weight quietly, assuming this is simply what a full, successful life requires, without ever questioning whether that assumption is genuinely accurate. The man from our story eventually made several deliberate changes after recognizing how much energy his complicated life had been quietly consuming without his full awareness. He sold his large house, moving into something considerably smaller and easier to maintain, requiring far less time and attention devoted to upkeep. He canceled most of his subscriptions, keeping only the few he genuinely used regularly and valued consistently throughout an ordinary week. He significantly reduced his social calendar, choosing fewer commitments pursued with genuine attention rather than many commitments pursued while feeling perpetually exhausted and distracted. Within a few months, he described feeling something he had not experienced in years, a genuine surplus of energy available for relationships and hobbies he had long neglected. This surplus did not appear because his life became empty or lacking in any meaningful sense, but because it finally became appropriately sized for what he actually valued. This process reveals something important about how excess quietly functions within most people's lives, whether or not they consciously recognize this pattern occurring around them regularly. Energy spent maintaining unnecessary complexity is energy unavailable for genuine connection, creativity, rest, or meaningful engagement with anything a person actually cares about deeply. This does not mean every possession or commitment should be eliminated entirely, since some complexity genuinely serves meaningful purposes within a well-lived life. It means honestly examining which elements of daily life actually earn their energy cost and which elements simply exist out of habit, inertia, or unexamined assumption. Once this reclaimed energy exists, freed from unnecessary maintenance and obligation, a person becomes genuinely free to direct it toward what actually matters most to them personally. And once someone experiences this reclaimed energy consistently, directing it deliberately toward relationships, creativity, rest, and genuine presence, something deeper naturally begins to follow afterward. They arrive gradually at a steadier, more sustainable form of contentment, not dependent on constant acquisition, constant maintenance, or constant management of an overly complicated life. This contentment feels different from the temporary satisfaction that new purchases or added commitments once provided, since it does not require constant renewal or replacement over time. Instead, it rests on something far more stable, a life appropriately sized for genuine values rather than inflated by unexamined habit or external comparison and expectation. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And this simple sentence connects directly to the quiet satisfaction found within an uncomplicated life. Most people imagine that fulfillment requires constant addition, achievement, and accumulation. Yet Jung's words suggest something entirely different from this common assumption. Becoming who you truly are rarely requires more, but often requires removing everything that obscures a person's genuine nature underneath years of unexamined habit and expectation. Simplicity, understood this way, is not about having little for its own sake or embracing deprivation as some kind of moral achievement worth pursuing. It is about deliberately removing everything that does not genuinely serve a person's true self, values, and sense of meaningful direction in daily life. This distinction matters significantly, since simplicity practiced purely for appearance or discipline often feels hollow, restrictive, and ultimately unsustainable over any meaningful length of time. Genuine simplicity emerges instead from honest self-examination, asking clearly what actually supports a fulfilling life versus what merely occupies space without real purpose. A person might genuinely need certain possessions, commitments, or relationships that another person would consider unnecessary, since genuine needs vary meaningfully between different individuals. The goal is never matching some universal standard of minimalism, but honestly evaluating what specifically serves your own authentic values and daily well-being. There exists an old story worth remembering here, describing a wealthy figure who eventually renounces status and possessions voluntarily, not from lack, but from newfound clarity. This figure does not become poor through misfortune or failure, but chooses deliberately to release accumulated wealth once realizing it no longer served genuine happiness. Ancient traditions across many cultures repeat this pattern consistently, describing figures who willingly step away from status and possession once clarity finally arrives. This pattern suggests something deeply true about human psychological development, that clarity about what matters often naturally leads towards simplification rather than further accumulation. These figures are never portrayed as having lost something valuable, but as having finally gained genuine freedom previously obscured by unnecessary complexity and external expectation. This reveals an important paradox worth understanding clearly, one that becomes visible only through direct experience rather than through explanation or theory alone. The less a person needs to feel complete, the freer and steadier they actually become, no longer dependent on constant acquisition to maintain their sense of worth. Someone who requires very little to feel genuinely content cannot easily be destabilized by loss, change, or circumstances beyond their immediate control. Someone who requires constant acquisition and validation to feel worthy remains perpetually vulnerable, since satisfaction always depends on the next purchase, achievement, or external comparison. This vulnerability creates a subtle but persistent anxiety that many people carry without ever clearly identifying its actual source or origin. Simplicity gradually dissolves this vulnerability, not by eliminating desire entirely, but by grounding contentment in something more stable than constant external accumulation. Throughout this video, we have explored how simplicity clears space, reduces comparison, restores presence, and reclaims energy previously lost to unnecessary complexity and excess. Each of these changes builds naturally upon the previous one, gradually creating a life that feels lighter, clearer, and genuinely more satisfying than before. None of this requires dramatic transformation, extreme restriction, or rejecting comfort and ambition entirely from someone's daily life and future planning. It simply requires honest, ongoing examination of what genuinely serves a person's true self and a willingness to release whatever does not serve that purpose. This process rarely happens all at once, but unfolds gradually through small decisions repeated consistently over weeks, months, and eventually years of practice. Living simply does not shrink a person's life or diminish its richness in any meaningful sense, despite what constant cultural pressure toward more might suggest. Instead, it reveals what was always meaningful within that life, previously buried beneath layers of unnecessary accumulation, comparison, and unexamined obligation. A simpler life is not a smaller life, but a clearer one, allowing genuine values, relationships, and experiences to finally receive the attention they deserve. If anything in this video resonated with you personally, consider pressing like and subscribing so we can continue exploring these ideas together in future videos. And if you have ever made a simple change that brought unexpected peace or clarity into your life, share that story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Proof that less truly can become more when chosen deliberately and with genuine self-awareness.